Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Happy to be with you. I want to thank George for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. I want to thank you for coming and for your personal commitments to do something serious for peace and justice in your education and professional work. The central question for this session is, how can we talk peace or teach peace in the face of threats from terrorist bombings, proliferating weapons of mass destruction, gross violations of human rights, religious extremism, violent conflicts over oil or food or even water shortages, climate disruption. And we could add to this list the dismay, the denial, the moral escapism, the numbing that you may have witnessed in your students, some of them at least, students who feel these emotions because of the continued killing in wars in places like Afghanistan, wars that may seem necessary but are yet not very promising morally or politically. The question, how can we possibly talk about peace in the face of violence, is really a question about credibility. Can we maintain credibility while pointing toward a third path, one that avoids the familiar alternatives of going to war against threats to us, or on the other hand, surrendering to those threats? So I'm going to talk mainly about this question of how to gain credibility. Not a single one of the problems I've mentioned can be addressed effectively in the sense of achieving a sustainable peace by war or preparation for war. The reason we are peace researchers is not because we are naive or idealistic or soft-headed, or because we have faith in some natural human harmony that's going to break out and make everything right. No, it's because we are trying to be realistic, because we take a hard look at evidence, because we use science and logic wherever we can to understand the inevitability of human conflict and how to enable humans to wage conflict without killing each other or unfairly dominating each other. Every problem I've mentioned, if understood on a deep level, is really a problem of governance, of difficult relationships between people making claims and counterclaims against each other with the threat of violence in the background. We might turn Karl von Clausewitz around and say that politics or governance is the continuation of war by other means. We might begin a class by saying to students that any issue that's currently being addressed through war or armed conflict could be addressed more effectively and at lower cost through political means. Peace studies is simply figuring out how to make those means, those political means, available, how to ensure that they are reliable, and how to ensure that everybody's security is protected. Peace studies enables us to find ways to continue a fight or to deal with conflict in more civilized ways. It doesn't expect conflict to end. Peace studies enables us to demilitarize conflicts and to move them from the battlefield to political processes, whether those processes are employed governing local, national, regional, or global relationships. You might say, the more that violence threatens us, threatens to engulf us, the more we need peace studies. My thesis today is simply that the most credible way to address today's security problems and simultaneously to advance all people's legitimate interests is to employ the full range of peace research tools to develop the policies and institutions that can assure us a sustainable and just peace. We need at least as much serious preparation for building peace as we put into preparation for war. I'm interested in whether you think the way I'm about to talk about peace studies would give you credibility with your students, your faculty members, your deans. This is how I would do it, and I'm eager to learn how you would do it, which I will learn in your question and answer period or in other conversations with you later today. I have 9 suggestions, but I assure you I'm not going to develop them in any detail until I get to about number 7. Okay, first, to achieve credibility, we should begin conversation with students on security issues, where they are on the issues, not necessarily where we are. And we should embody in our teaching and professional conduct our best understanding of good conflict transformation strategy. This means listening carefully, deeply, to what students are saying and to what they're feeling and may not be saying. We need to pay attention to students' fears because these shape a person's worldview, and if they're unacknowledged, they produce rigidity and frozen responses to much of what people hear. Even when we think that what others are saying is unwarranted, we need to understand the experiential content from which they speak. In John Paul Lederach's words, this means we should not let the presenting issue, what he calls the presenting issue, be the complete focus. To establish credibility, all questions need to be entertained if the questioner is willing to have a conversation. The almost insurmountable security problems that confront our students today are so serious and complicated that we can quite honestly say that only a deep and comprehensive analysis, such as provided by interdisciplinary peace research, can begin to maximize our prospects for addressing the problems effectively. Less comprehensive approaches that focus mainly on how to use violence to stop violence are likely to be ineffective in the long run. With those, at worst, violence will beget further violence. At best, violent means can only buy time to start all over again after an armed conflict has ended, to search for more lasting solutions. Students may tell us that our need for security is the justification for war. True enough. Yet when you stop to think about it, the need of every human being for security is also the justification for peace research. The first justification, that is national security, takes a fairly shallow view of security and how to achieve it, whereas peace research calls for a deeper understanding of human security and how to achieve it. It's by starting with the fears of insecurity and then showing how people can take practical steps to increase their security that gives peace studies credibility at the outset. Second, we should note that peace research arose as a response to the inadequacies of more traditional approaches to the study of war and peace. Because of their relatively narrow analytic lenses and their lack of imagination about the prospects for change, these traditional approaches are ones that peace research may draw upon or build upon, but must move beyond with a more comprehensive view. For example, as Peter Wallenstein's article demonstrates, the article that I suggested you might read before the session this morning, peace research has a continuing difference with Machiavelli, for example, and with political realism, in seeing ethical questions as always present and pertinent in decision-making. Yet, given that fact, we need to be very careful we don't get involved in a self-righteous attitude and judgmentalism toward those with a different point of view. That really makes peace studies ineffective. Peace research builds on some insights of political realism, as I said, but doesn't merely stop at trying to denounce it or discredit it. To explain the merits of interdisciplinary peace research, we do not need to denigrate other disciplines. Medical research, for example, doesn't denigrate organic chemistry or biochemistry. It uses them to move beyond them. We gain credibility by looking for ways to include others in the peace studies enterprise, even while we need to be watchful that we don't let our program get hijacked by those who don't understand it or feel deeply committed to it. Third, we must emphasize that peace research has a strong empirical basis. Many peace researchers have an analysis of power realities that's very similar to that of political realists, observing, for example, that states often are power maximizers in a relatively anarchic balance of power system, even though at the same time they believe that this system is not beyond change. Fourth, peace research also has an inventive and imaginative emphasis, manifested in the best of what we might call relevant utopian thinking. Peace researchers ask not only why things are the way they are, they also ask how we might make them better. The way the world is does not fully encompass the way it might be. Peace researchers are sometimes misunderstood as being soft because they are open-minded to the prospect of positive change. We can counter this mischaracterization of peace studies by being sure that whenever we talk about change, we connect the prospects for it to the realities of political struggle, the necessity usually for political struggle to accompany that change. So peace research gains credibility by combining the deepest insights of realist and utopian approaches. Fifth, peace researchers' interest in value realization helps us point out to students that politics, including international politics, is always a value realizing process. To talk about it as if it's not is a mirage. Someone's values are always being realized and someone else's may be compromised in international political decisions. So we need to perform value clarification in every analysis that we conduct. We need to keep asking who benefits from a particular decision or maintenance of a particular structure, and who pays. Sensitivity to value realization takes peace studies beyond, for example, security studies, which typically devises strategies to use military instruments more effectively, but usually does not show us how existing policies and structures make it difficult to reduce reliance on military power by strengthening the rule of law in world affairs. Yet movement in that direction is necessary to make significant enhancements in human security in the long run. Sixth, peace research can credibly claim to be relevant and realistic because it sees some opportunity in almost every crisis. We look, in other words, for the opportunity in crises that become salient in the national or international agenda. Before war or genocide occurs, we and our students can work at prevention. During war or genocide, we can work with students and other peace studies people to bring a swift termination to the killing. After massive destruction and killing and inflamed hostility occur in war-torn states, peace studies works at peace building and sustaining peace. And all the time, recommendations for transforming any particular conflict need to be thoughtfully related to the structural changes that we feel are useful for making sustainable peace. Every small step that we recommend should help us move toward the long-term changes in local, national, and global governance, in economic structures, and in human relationships that will enable less violent and more just lives for all people on earth. That's really strategic peace building on the international level. As I've already suggested, we may find it useful to note for our students that peace studies is analogous in some ways to medical studies. What medical research does for human health, peace research should do for human security. Both are interdisciplinary, both are problem-centered, both are rigorous at their best, both have an applied dimension as well as a basic research dimension. Both have a value dimension, privileging human health and well-being over human destruction. Findings in both fields are sometimes ignored by those who would most benefit from those findings. And both continue to uncover new factors that contribute to health and peace. Of course, there are differences. The need for medical schools and for medical training is well recognized. Not so yet for peace studies. As you probably noticed, the House of Representatives recently passed a bill, for example, that calls for $0 to go to the U.S. Institute of Peace. Seventh point, and this I'll try to develop in more detail. We can demonstrate peace studies' credibility by showing the contributions that peace researchers can make in addressing specific problems. It's that taking up specific issues that people are concerned about that gives us our most credibility, I think. Let me mention four possible examples by way of illustration. We have some special things, important, specific things to say about the causes of violent conflict. Also, the comparative utilities of military power to other forms of power for addressing real problems. The conditions essential for transforming violent conflict into sustainable peace in the 21st century. What are those? And we can talk very directly about the impediments to establishing sustainable peace. In each of these areas, I'm going to talk briefly about one contribution that a peace studies perspective has to offer, a contribution that might be missed without peace research. Now, my emphasis is going to be on peace researchers' contributions to enhancing global governance. But if you think this emphasis is too sweeping or too theoretical, you could supply your own illustrations of what peace research might have to offer in each of these four areas that I've mentioned and that you see on the screen. We could just as well talk about how to increase respect for human rights, or how to address the psychological dimensions of exclusive identities, or how to nurture religious tolerance among all faith traditions, or many other areas. So you should bring your own area of specialization or your college or university's particular strengths into the discussion of these general areas. Okay, let me go back then to the causes of violent conflict. To illustrate how peace research can contribute to students' understanding of why violence is likely to arise in their lives, I want to reflect on the parable of the tragedy of the commons that Garrett Hardin brought to our attention many years ago. We should ask our students and ourselves to imagine, just for a moment, that we live in a medieval village. We each own a separate herd of cattle, or goats, or sheep, and we live close together, of course, in the medieval village, but during the day we take our herds out to the common pastures that surround the village. All of us let all of our livestock graze on these pastures, and each of us calculates that it's in our interest to expand the size of our own herd. So we do that. But gradually, our herds grow so large that they overgraze the pastures. Grass becomes less abundant. Topsoil erodes. Eventually, the commons are destroyed. Now, even if you and I know that the commons are in the process of being destroyed, unless we can be assured that others will constrain the size of their herds if we limit ours, we won't cut back. It wouldn't even be sensible to, really. We will go ahead and earn as much as we can as fast as we can before the commons are diminished and destroyed by expanding our own herds. Now, if all herders make this individually rational decision, the commons certainly will be destroyed, and all of us will suffer an irretrievable loss and will be less well off than we were before. Students can easily see that the tragedy of the commons could have been overcome if herd owners simply would have created an overarching political authority that would have been capable of enforcing an agreement to limit each person's herd to the size that, when added to other herds, would enable them to enjoy, but not to destroy, the common pastures. Peace studies, in other words, can help students understand that resistance to creating an overarching political authority or regulatory agency can have deadly consequences. As conditions endanger people's security in this process, violent conflict is likely. We need to understand that acting independently to maximize one's own self-interest can ultimately destroy a shared resource, even when it's clear that it's not in anyone's long-term interest for this to happen. So, the first point in developing this idea of credibility as a way of looking at the causes of conflict is, without an overarching political authority or conflict resolution mechanism that includes all those actors who are in conflict, war or domination is likely as independent actors seek advantages amidst declining economic opportunities. Again, to take a real-world example, one reason that the United States refused some years ago to join the Kyoto guidelines for constraining greenhouse gases, when most European states did, was to avoid any constraint on short-term profits in the United States. But because not all of the other countries were willing to join the Kyoto guidelines, one could argue that it was rational for the United States to maximize profit in the short run, even if this could contribute in the long run to destroying the environment, because free riders left outside of the agreement would wreck the environment anyway. My own view is that not enough weight was given to how the U.S. support of Kyoto could have moved the whole world closer to a global regime that would bring all societies into the guidelines. But I just want to make the point that the rational conduct in the short run, at least, could argue for what the United States did because of the possibility of free riders, especially the U.S. was complaining about large third world countries not being in it. Okay. Let's take a look at the second example. What is the utility of military power for solving our real security problems? There are numerous examples of the very low utility of military power. The initially quick U.S. victories in both Iraq and Afghanistan showed the ability of military power to destroy, but the slow winning of the peace, punctuated by the President's address just last night after 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan, this shows that the narrowly limited utility of military power can't really give us a winning of the peace that we want. And it shows some of the counterproductive inutilities of military power. Non-military forms of power have to be used to address the tragedies in these societies in the long run. Peace researcher Kenneth Boulding, some years ago, in his book, The Three Faces of Power, showed that military power has little utility compared with what he called the exchange power of economic interactions and the integrative power of cooperative measures such as international agreements that build unity for working together. Against new security threats that cannot be confined within a territorial state, national military power often turns out to have little utility. It's best for conflicts that can be exclusively controlled within a state or limited to a state's territory. This is especially true, its inutility, when compared to the bargaining power of economic incentives for compliance with international rules, or to the integrative power that comes from institutionalizing a rule of law and international enforcement able to generate mutual benefits. even among societies with a history of conflicts, as the European Union has demonstrated in removing the expectation of war within Europe, especially between Germany and France. Take the third example. We need to find ways to have credible discussions of the need for what I call structural changes, changes in the way the international system itself is set up. Such changes are probably necessary to establish institutions that are capable of ensuring a sustainable peace in the 21st century. For talking about this, I would select a second parable, one made famous by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his effort to discuss the need for governance. We might ask students to imagine people living in a state of nature, where people aren't corrupted by any state institutions or corporations or ideologies. Rousseau describes 5 hungry men who decide to work together to catch a stag in order to avoid starvation. If they succeed, each will have enough food for himself and his family, and they encircle a stag and are about to close in on it when one of the 5 hunters sees a hare nearby that he can catch to satisfy his needs alone. He hesitates, knowing that if he pursues the rabbit, the stag may well get away. But he eventually decides to go after the hare because if he does not, someone else in the hunting party might see it, go after it, and leave him with nothing at all. While he catches the hare, the stag gets away. Kenneth Waltz, the eminent political realist, summarizes this parable in his first book, Man, the State, and War, and he concludes the following. The story is simple, the implications are tremendous. In cooperative action, even where all agree on the goal and have an equal interest in the project, one cannot rely on others. This is a powerful lesson for students to understand. Yet, it seems to me that Waltz leaves us somewhat at a loss. Let me repeat. Even where all agree on the goal and have an equal interest in the project, one cannot rely on others. Okay, where do you go from there? Without rejecting Waltz's conclusion, the peace researcher might build on it in a different way. We might say, without an overarching political authority to make human conduct more reliable, even efforts at cooperative rational conduct can lead to division and eventual destruction. But with one, that is, with such an authority, we can reliably maximize mutual benefits. This formulation opens the door to a recognition that an agreement among the 5 humans that could ensure that anyone who leaves his assigned post while hunting a stag, such as to go after a hare, would be required to share the hare equally with everybody in the hunting party. Such an agreement, if it could be enforced by some authority encompassing all, would enable the hunting party to succeed. Like in the tragedy of the commons, the peace research moral of this story could be that because rational conduct can lead to self-destruction in the absence of a community-wide authority capable of enforcing agreements and ensuring cooperative action, structural change, systemic change, to establish such an authority or to take steps leading toward it are necessary. Peace researchers can credibly demonstrate that one permissive cause of armed conflict is an international system that allows sovereign states to take what we might call the hare option. To address this cause, it may be necessary to establish a system of dependable cooperation on the stag option in order to serve the security of all. To continue a system that allows separate actors to serve their selfish interests at the expense of the common weal is unlikely to solve our problem. Too abstract, so think of how to apply this to a concrete present problem. one of the most serious of the day. Let's say the spread of nuclear technology that's capable of being used to produce weapons of mass destruction. It's the inequity in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that illustrates the Hare option. The United States and other nuclear powers want to keep their own nuclear weapons. So they haven't delivered on their obligations under Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which calls on them to negotiate nuclear arms reduction. Yet, they're trying to ensure that other countries without nuclear weapons honor their obligations under the treaty, which is not to develop nuclear weapons. This way, nuclear weapons countries keep satisfying their military appetite by retaining their weapons. They keep going after the hare. Meanwhile, they're trying to stifle the appetite of other states for what they already have. So if Iran and North Korea decide to pursue the hare option, the nuclear powers may use threats to let them know that we don't want them to do what we nuclear powers have already done. It's very easy for national security managers to blame Iran and North Korea for being destabilizing actors, as they are. And peace researchers also wouldn't generally want them to get nuclear weapons, but peace researchers would also point out that the permissive international system invites the hare option. A deeper understanding immediately suggests that a more serious approach to nuclear nonproliferation would aim at reducing existing nuclear arsenals in every country and simultaneously stop both horizontal and vertical proliferation, and in fact dismantle existing nuclear arsenals to move toward greater equity. In these two parables, we find the wisdom necessary for understanding the utility of international laws and representative international institutions for peace building. In these, we see why strengthening the rule of law and representative institutions on the global level have a place of central importance in peace studies, or I think should. Okay. Yet, peace researchers should also point out that the parables do not answer an underlying question of why. To be credible, we must answer the why question. Why do we not have more effective international laws and institutions already? Peace researchers might suggest an answer by noting that in contrast to today's international system, the states who formed the European Union within a regional system took advantage of Kenneth Boulding's third form of power, the integrative power of legally binding international agreements. They used this form to avert a post-1945 tragedy of the security commons in Europe, following the tragedies of World War I and World War II. That is, the EU helped avert further war in Europe. To be credible in answering the why question, we need to expand discussion of the conditions essential for sustainable peace in the 21st century to include other peace research findings. Let me illustrate this quickly by mentioning 4 guidelines that need to be operational in trying to address specific problems. The first guideline suggests we need to pay more attention to the principle of reciprocity or reciprocal rights in analysis and in policymaking. Reciprocal rights are understood in every culture and every religious tradition on earth. We need to consider how reciprocity might be applied to nuclear non-proliferation policy, again, to go back to that example. Although the United States asks Iran to place all of its nuclear installations under strict IAEA inspection, asks it not to develop any nuclear weapons, asks it not to possess any nuclear weapons, the United States has not done any of these itself, even the IAEA inspection. In fact, the U.S. Senate has refused to ratify a treaty that other nuclear powers favor, which is to ban further nuclear testing. The second guideline that we should utilize is what Johan Galtung has called the associative strategy of conflict transformation, as opposed to the dissociative, or sort of the way of resolving conflict through separation. A time is appropriate for both. For example, you may need the dissociative strategy in Sudan, where the South is separate from the North. But generally speaking, the main global security issues call for, I think, associative strategies. We need to look for the utility in cooperative, integrative forms of power, such as Boulding mentioned, and such as we find manifested in the structural changes in the European Union. The result has been to eliminate the expectation of war in Europe after a century in which dissociative strategies and the European balance of power totally failed. Even if the EU now founders on the hard rocks of economic rivalry over paying debts, and it's not out of the question, the points I'm making here would nonetheless remain true because they have happened. If the EU and the euro now fail, it will be because of the resurrection of the Hare option. An associative strategy would probably, for example, lead the United States to ratify the statute of the International Criminal Court, because we ignore some losses for the security commons, and we pursue the Hare option when we ask the world, through the International Criminal Court, to prosecute the Sudanese and the Libyan heads of government for crimes against humanity, which I think is a good idea. But it's while the United States refuses to accept the court's jurisdiction itself. A third principle conducive to global peacebuilding emphasizes equity, especially illustrated in economic relationships. Peace researchers can gain credibility by paying attention to the harsh empirical realities reflected, for example, in the income gap between the richest 1/5 of the world's population and the poorest 1/5. This is a rather graphic and dramatic example. The ratio estimated back in 1820 between the richest and the poorest fifth was 3-1. By 1870, it was 7-1. By 1913, 11-1. 1960, 30-1. 1990, 60-1. 1997, 74-1. We think now estimates are that it has risen to 82-1. What does that say about the structure of the international system? And keep in mind that we have only one global economic system. And we're all part of it, whether we want to be or not. It's the system that exists. The philosopher Thomas Pogge argues that the wealthy societies, whether deliberately or not, actually perpetuate the existing international economic system. This perpetuation prevents poverty-stricken people from rising out of poverty. I think no system of religious ethics that I know of, or even secular for that matter, would justify these inequities. So, to address security problems arising from this structural violence, peace researchers can identify associative peace-building strategies of structural change of the international system while employing the principles of reciprocity and equity. So, the beginning of the answer to the why question, why don't we have more effective responses to the parables, is that we don't take these three conflict transforming strategies and guidelines seriously enough. But there's a fourth point. We also gain credibility by taking more seriously the impediments to establishing sustainable international and domestic peace. The most obvious impediments are largely a matter of not being able to establish sufficient political feasibility to implement the changes that peace research can document are desirable and could make us, well, could make all the people of the world, collectively at least, healthier, wealthier, and wiser if we would let it happen. Desirable initiatives are not politically feasible at the present moment because of three factors. First, there is excessive faith in the utility of military power and the existing international system to provide security. Second, there is excessive faith in the largely unregulated market system to solve economic and political problems. And third, there is widespread belief that the relatively anarchical balance of power system is unchangeable, or perhaps that it's natural, or some believe both, despite evidence to the contrary. Now, at this point in the conversation, it's very likely that our critics will say, well, this is just a little much. This is too much, maybe. So what do we do? Well, I think it's always good to show that there are some very practical benefits of this analytic framework. And there are modest steps that can be taken in the short run that don't affect anybody's security negatively, but that will fit in with the longer-term structural changes that are needed. And we can show that maintaining existing patterns of belief and action actually cause us a lot of problem. They perpetuate a system in which many people in the world feel they're being victimized, feel they're not being heard, feel their dignity and perhaps their identity even is threatened, feel the normal processes of conflict resolution are blocked. These are very common beliefs throughout much of the world. Some people, even in the Tea Party, share them. And if these feelings aren't addressed with effective political processes to address current problems, people tend to become more willing to support political polarization, extremism. So those are reasons why this analysis can gain credibility by showing that unless we address those, we're really going to work ourselves into a deeper hole. My ninth and then last point on our credibility list is the need to remind students that our daunting political point, the main daunting political point, that rational conduct may lead to destruction in anarchic contexts, this point remains true, we have to remind our students, only if the anarchic condition remains essentially unchanged. If we decide to do something different with the state of anarchy, then we can begin to build much more peace and justice. It's possible to escape the dilemma posed by the need, on the one hand, for short-term self-protection against threats, and the danger, on the other hand, that pursuing it blindly will lead to long-term self-destruction if we directly seek the long-term protection of the good of all in a systematic, sustained way that tries to institutionalize change to avoid backsliding. To put it back in the hands, or within the view of the parables, the stag hunters and the sheep herders needed to change the systems in which they lived, just enough to create an overarching authority to ensure sufficient self-restraint in hunting and in animal husbandry to protect common interests. It's not asking too much, is it? It's not asking a lot. Actually, it helps them serve common interest. This wouldn't have required overthrowing everything then, and it doesn't require overthrowing everything now. It only requires reforms that are quite acceptable when you see the realities comprehensively. If the present international system does not protect everyone's common interest in security, if it cannot deter governments from drastically unacceptable behavior or non-governmental actors from mega-terrorism, and if it cannot prevent the spread and use of weapons of mass destruction, then no one on earth can be safe ever again. Faced with that reality, the international system needs to be changed. A useful peace research exercise is to ask students to examine existing realities carefully and to identify practical steps that they might recommend to transform the existing balance of power system into something more democratic, more equitable, more capable of peace, something that can increase human security while decreasing the role that military power might play in world affairs. Ask them, in other words, what they think can be done to domesticate the international system. If our students are interested in saving the security commons from threats of terrorist violence, from imperial ambitions and military aggression, from recurring mass murders, from the reality of readily available weapons of mass destruction, and from further environmental deterioration, then there is no escaping the need for more effective global governance. Peace research is a promising antidote, I'm saying, to the security problems we face, because there is no way to undo the interdependence of societies and to make them invulnerable to each other. For that reason, traditional conflict management policies that privilege dissociative strategies, the exclusive kind of identities that usually accompany radically independent states, and the dominance of powerful states in an anarchic international system will no longer work. The choice really is between common security and insecurity. If policymakers continue to pursue strategies of dominance and radical independence, peace research suggests these strategies are built usually on policymakers' tendency to engage in psychological mechanisms of denial, avoidance, and projection. That is, denial of reality, avoidance of underlying reasons for violent conflict, and of projection of their own repressed impulses on an adversary. So, if we follow these 9 suggestions, we may be able to maintain credibility in talking about peace building. Despite its deficiencies, peace research has begun to show convincingly that the most promising security strategy is one that will, if it can be made politically feasible, bring together all security stakeholders, including the most adversarial, to talk about an associative future satisfactory for all concerned, and to develop rules and institutions to govern conduct in order to make conduct more reliable than it was in the parables of the stag hunt and the tragedy of the commons. Such an approach is also morally preferable because it aims to govern conduct by implementing principles of reciprocity, equity, and mutual respect. As peace researchers, we and our students can help to identify and implement these more promising peace-building strategies. And that, I think, is our calling. Thank you very much. We have time for comments, questions. Do I field these? Yes, you do. Okay. Over here, let's start.
Okay. Well, you talk about an overarching authority, and I know that my students will automatically ask me, do you have any scenarios or do you have sort of an idea of what that overarching authority might be? That's question number 1. Question number 2, you talk a lot about the traditional way of looking at things. And I think, in agreement with that, I just want to add that the actors have changed, and therefore the strategies of dealing with international conflict has also changed. It's not the state actor, which is usually the traditional assumption, and therefore, because of the complexity of things, we need to, respond differently than we usually responded just with military power.
Yes. Okay, 2 excellent questions. First, the overarching authority. I mean, it would be a mistake to have a blueprint because that would be premature, what I would call premature specificity. That is, too much specificity at this time would be unrealistic. And I don't have in mind, there's going to be some singular meeting where the world comes together, sits down, and works out all its problems. I think it's going to be muddier than that. It's going to be more ad hoc than that. But we know the direction we want to head would be to increase the ability to have effective representation for all the world's people, to identify norms or directions they want to have, and then to have anything that could be agreed upon dependable, reliable, monitored, enforced. You can't have world peace that's sustainable without enforcement. Just as you can't have peace in any city in the country without law enforcement. So this isn't a talk against coercive mechanisms. It's a talk in favor of developing forms of coercion that are acceptable when they're needed, which generally is associated with the rule of law. It's about the only instrument we have developed. And this is what fits the parables. In both parables, things failed because they couldn't get sufficient agreement to have a reliable setting of norms. And I want to underscore that it would have been in their strong common interest to have done so. If just before destroying the commons they could have agreed not to expand their herds anymore, it would have been in everybody's self-interest. But it didn't happen. So don't look for a blueprint. Say this has got to grow out of a political evolutionary process. The things we have to do, though, are increase equitable representation, take everybody's interests seriously, and focus on ways to get agreed upon norms enforced, monitored and enforced. Now, if this is too abstract, we have lots of illustrations of where things are beginning to move in that direction. I mean, the International Criminal Court is one example of this. It is an amazing delegation of authority, legal authority when you stop to think about it. More than 100 countries have ratified their own statute, and this says that individuals can be held criminally accountable for violating the prohibitions of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. They can be held accountable as individuals, even if they're heads of government. Even if they're heads of government. So this is the ability to enforce community norms on individuals. That's the most effective form of enforcement. Hard to enforce the law on a complete country. If a country violates it, a norm, and you say the head of state can be protected by the country, you don't really have an effective enforcement mechanism. But if you can enforce on individuals, you begin to have an effective mechanism. There are problems, of course, but I'm just saying that's an illustration. The World Trade Organization is another example. You do have enforceable, coercive mechanisms for ensuring that states follow certain practices in trade. If violated, there are penalties that usually make them not violate the outcome of the adjudicatory process. You have other illustrations of it in the UN Charter, although I hate to hesitate to mention the UN because it has so many flaws, but certainly the prohibitions of the use of force for any reason other than self-defense or when the Security Council authorizes it, that's a step in the right direction. There are lots of steps in the right direction that we can illustrate where to go, address the problems, the flaws that exist in the UN, in the World Trade Organization, or in the International Criminal Court. There's another regional example to which I referred, the European Union. Now, there's, of course, more cultural similarity in European states than there is in world cultures, but still, if you can have an overarching political authority in a country as diverse as Europe, or if you can have the diversity of all the different cultures and languages and religious faiths in a subcontinent like India, you have that within one political structure, it's imaginable that you could have the whole world. I'm not talking about a world state or a world government, but you would have the whole world participating in an international organization that would more effectively monitor, let's say, nuclear weapons capability. It would mean beefing up the IAEA. It would mean having some enforcement mechanisms that are expanded. It would mean having even more intrusive without warning inspections, things of that sort. These are very imaginable and doable. Just a minute. I got to get the second part, but it's taking too long. But second part was the world's changed. There are a lot of different avenues. Of course, that's true. But if you look carefully, most of these changes argue in favor of this kind of a solution. Look at the problems that have arisen because of non-state actors engaging in mega-terrorism. There's no way to deal with that on a territorial basis, simply a nation-state basis. Really, to have protection against terrorism, you need cooperation among police across borders everywhere in the world. You need cooperation on intelligence, that is, identifying terrorist threats before they're manifested. This isn't something you can do by just beefing up your own military forces. Impossible. You can do that only with collaboration from others, and especially from others who may be the most, reluctant to cooperate with you. It's really those who are least eager to cooperate with us from whom we need the most cooperation. You don't do that by twisting their arms or by threatening them. That simply generates more problems. So the changing security equation is exactly the reason that logic drives us to this conclusion. There is no alternative, though we might like one, other than more associative solutions to security problems. That's good.
I'm not against associative solutions to security problems, but one of the things that has happened, certainly in this country since I was a young person, is less and less people go by those external laws. We have all kinds of laws in this country, and people are continually violating them. For example, cheating. Cheating behavior is endemic in our culture. We've had discussions in our class where students feel it's okay. Whereas when I was growing up, it was an internalized system. And there's a good psychological evidence to show that if you can internalize behavior before children get to a certain age, they're much more likely to behave without the external stick in their heads, and in the long run, that's more effective. So what we have in the United States is a runaway philosophy that believes in not obeying laws, in a certain sense, in running after the hare no matter what. And our government and the big actors now are not states, they're actually corporations.
Yes.
So how do you regulate corporations when they're no longer subjected to national rules?
Well, you're raising several excellent questions. I agree with your analysis, essentially. Dan Ariely, in his book, Predictable Irrationalities, documents this rise in willingness to cheat. And he's a behavioral economist. He points out this is especially true in corporate life. And that the large number of corporations that have, where executives engage in cheating is increasing, and he thinks this is going to have a negative impact on the U.S. economically, actually. The same thing for banks. If left unregulated, they're willing to take advantage of their own clients even by being dishonest or misleading. So this is a very serious problem. It's true not only here, of course, it's true worldwide, problem of corruption. I don't know of a lot of studies that show this, but anecdotally at least you feel that political leadership also is much more willing to say anything and then do something else than ever before. And this, of course, undermines democracy. But your series of examples and your analysis really points again, I think, to an associative form of response. You're describing things like personal beliefs, ethics, identities. These are not as, identities aren't as inclusive as they ought to be. Ethics aren't as strongly held as they ought to be against corruption. What do we do about this? Well, I have no magical solution. And what I propose doesn't directly deal with that, but there have to be ways of addressing this. I mean, one thing is we need better education, public education, to make it clear to people how there is an erosion of values and ways of thinking and acting that actually undermine the kind of society we want to build. And unless we do that, things will get worse. So this means we have to address the problem on many levels, including the religious or the secular educational levels at very early ages in people's lives. And it needs to be done everywhere. I don't want to take all questions from this side, though I like everybody on this side. But what about the back? You're waiting to raise a question? Go ahead.
So we are actually facing, or actually in the middle of the tragedy of the commons with climate change. And I feel like it's a disruption or genocide of huge chunks of humanity without an obvious war, although it can lead to war. So I'm just kind of curious what the discourse in peace studies is around this, in the sense of already being in the middle of the tragedy of climate change.
Well, what's your question? What does peace studies have to offer?
Right, well, what's the discourse in peace studies around this kind of perspective on this current tragedy of commons?
I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you're asking.
Okay. So I'm actually coming from the point of view of environmental studies. So I'm trying to think what is peace studies, what's the discourse here in peace studies around the fact that we're already engaged in a big disruption and potential genocide of large chunks of humanity without war specifically, although it can be leading to war.
Well, there's a growing segment of peace studies that looks at environmental decline or deepening environmental problems as a source of security issues. Obviously, when environmental issues become directly threatening, they are security issues. They're life and death issues. So I think the environmental area, of course, is the area in which there is perhaps the clearest direct understanding that everything is connected with everything else eventually. And so it's a wonderful point of entree into peace studies, or put it differently, to do environmental studies well, one needs to deal with the political conflicts that arise over resource shortages or pollution dumping and things of that sort, so that this is a central feature in thinking about strategies to reduce conflict. Of course, as you know, a couple of decades ago, environmental issues internationally began to be connected very closely to sustainable development. Without sustainability, a policy recommendation wasn't considered credible. Well, sustainable development and sustainable peace go hand in hand. We can't really have long-term peace and security without having development and without having much greater equity. So reciprocity and equity and accepting the value, really, of every human being on Earth are essential both for environmental studies and peace studies, and they contribute. Yes?
Translating. In Colombia, one of the causes of violence is high inequality. And so, as you mentioned, and this is building off the last question, that necessitates some kind of structural change. But in particular, how would you recommend dealing with the challenges when those who are in charge of the major corporations are also the leaders of state institutions? Does that make sense?
Well, yes. To some extent, that's relevant even in the United States, isn't it? There's a growing tendency of people to win elections based on how much money they have, and they're getting money from corporate interests in order to serve those interests once the people are elected. I mean, this is a political issue. The answer is to call for transparency, to try to mobilize people to vote for their own self-interests. I mean, I'm happy to use ethical suggestions as a way of mobilizing people, but it would be enough often if they would simply vote in terms of their own enlightened self-interest. Where they don't have a voting opportunity, of course, you have to have even more fundamental change, such as maybe the young people in Cairo are a manifestation of having recognized that. It's not a very good answer, but about the best I can do. Question here?
I like what you presented, and I guess maybe a further question would be, when I think of teaching ideas like these to my students, I often think of my cousin Eric, the truck driver, because he represents a lot of ways. I mean, his arguments on an issue like this, I think I know pretty well. He would tend to be very much against anything that has to do with UN, ceding any national power to the UN, and he will support the UN less in proportion to the amount of inverse proportion to the amount of power the U.S. has in the UN. And that's exactly what I think we need to diminish, right? So how do we sell this to skeptics in the U.S. who feel that the only reason the U.S. should play any role in the UN is to the extent that we can call the shots there. And if we give up our power, then we should get out.
Everybody has some answers to that problem. But, I mean, I would point out to your, is this your friend or your cousin or your?
My cousin.
Your cousin.
But I think his ideas represent a lot
yes,
of the young men in my classes.
Yes. I recognize the arguments. Everybody here probably has heard them from our own relatives. But I mean, I would point out that the world's changing. It's not that we necessarily want it to, but it is. And that the U.S. really isn't as powerful on its own as he thinks it is. There's a kind of intellectual inertia here of being wedded to a pattern of the past that no longer exists. I mean, the U.S. economy is affected by what goes on in Frankfurt or Tokyo, and vice versa. And so far there's been no effective regulation to prevent a recurrence of the economic downturn that the whole world is suffering. If other countries get nuclear weapons, that further complicates and probably diminishes U.S. power. If global warming continues, that also undermines at least traditional bases of U.S. power. So it's an illusion, it's a mirage, really, to think that the U.S. is this extremely powerful country that can do everything on its own. That's over. And we don't like it, because we're Americans. I mean, the British didn't like the decline of the British Empire. You don't like it, but those days are over. So if you want effective ways to deal with the security problem of weapons of mass destruction, if you want to feel even halfway safe when you get on an airplane, for example, you've got to be more effective in dealing with the conditions that give rise to violence. And the only way to do that is a more cooperative stance toward the rest of the world. See, I don't view it as a net loss of U.S. power to have a stronger UN. I just view it as a reconfiguration of sovereignty in which, by giving over to the UN certain war-making functions of sovereignty, we actually may gain greater power over staying separate and alone. So, I mean, I think we should argue that it isn't a loss of power that we're talking about. It's actually simply a reconfiguration of it in order to enable us to do what we expect our government to do. The United States is slow in coming to this understanding, but many countries of the world, smaller countries, are well aware that they have very little national power by themselves. Members of parliaments in democratic countries all around the world know they can't do their job legislatively by themselves because they're affected by the IMF, by the world economy, by big corporations. So the idea that you can have an ideal or a democratic society that's really functioning well in isolation from the rest of the world is an illusion. Biggest countries are the last to recognize that. And dictatorial countries, of course, are the last to want to recognize the need for the rule of law for obvious reasons, self-evident reasons. But both will have to come to this realization. See, it's no surprise that you ask, who are the countries that haven't ratified their own statute? This only illustrates it. Most democracies in the world have, but who have not? The United States hasn't. India hasn't. China hasn't. Russia hasn't. And none of those four is about to. That's because they think they can get most of what they want without collaborating with the rest of the world. And the dictatorial systems like China and Russia, or Russia's in the middle here, they don't want to have the rule of law because they're afraid it will interfere with their ability to maintain their authoritarian control of society. So those are the countries that don't want to move ahead in establishing a greater rule of law, unless they can shape that law to serve their own interests in the law. But I think it's important. I mean, I would follow the first suggestion here. I would ask your cousin to talk more about his own security fears, his problems, and see where those lead. My guess is if you talk very long about security problems, you're going to eventually get to a place where he's going to say, well, I guess there's some need for having at least a few laws that everybody on Earth ought to obey, such as how to handle, let's see, how to govern nuclear materials. As soon as you have people acknowledge there's some laws that everybody on Earth has to obey for the rest of us to feel safe and secure, then you have at least a conversation about how to do that in a way that is fair, that upholds your interests, that, we don't want a global system that's authoritarian, we want one that's democratic and so on. Here, and then I'll come back over here.
I want to piggyback on what Rob was saying, because I can't help feeling that there's a lack of comprehensiveness in some of the analysis that you were giving of security concerns. And I think in part, the fears about security, I think, are very real, at least amongst the students that I teach. But I think also, and maybe this is where Froggarter comes in, there's also, I think, a certain amount of hubris, right? Because one of the things that I hear from my students about why we need to go to war is, well, there's all these other countries in the world that are demanding that the United States be global, right? And so there's a sense in which it's I think, the updated American version of the British Empire's white man burden, right? We have the obligation to police and civilize the world. And I think part of so that there's that hubristic justification for war, and I think where at least the fear it comes in part is it's really difficult for these students to deal emotionally with the fact that they are living in the waning days of an empire that their entire culture denies even exists, right? We talk about the United States as a democracy and completely ignore the fact that the way it's perceived by most of the rest of the world is this great big imperial invader, right? So we talk about, for instance, the war in Afghanistan without acknowledging that, dude, that was not a war. That was a blatant, illegal attack on defenseless people, right? That is to say, the Afghani people, not the Taliban, right? Because the Taliban closed the borders and prevented these people from leaving, and then we came in and bombed them, right? And I think my students have a lot of difficulty getting a grasp on what the reality is, and therefore getting a grasp on what their enlightened self-interest really is, because they're being told this big lie about what the relation of the United States to the rest of the world actually is. I don't know,
Yeah.
you got anything more to
Well,
say?
I think you're summing it up pretty well. I just became aware of the time. We're almost out, but I'd like
We
to hear
have
all
time.
the questions, even if
No,
we
we
don't
have time,
answers.
Rob.
So
We have-
let's hear the questions. Yeah.
Well, I think with enforcement, you're obviously implying that the use of force is sometimes necessary, and if so, I guess the big question is, who gets to decide who enforces, who gets that power?
Yeah. Okay. I have an answer. But I won't give it yet. I want to hear all the questions. Yes. Okay.
That is somehow linked with this. Looking at the speech and the decision by President Obama yesterday,
Yes.
seems like this associative approach or framework is being thought over by more people, and it might be actually the very successful recipe for peace in the world. However, looking at the fact that nations are different at different paces of development and understanding, and there are multiple conflicts existing in those countries, might also involve, since we are sitting here in the American context, and therefore we are looking at, America as being power, but also we might, as you have suggested, slightly, that we need multiple processes going on, economic as well as political and security related also. So I would just like to appreciate what I have heard and the combination of this speech coming together with your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One last
Yes.
question. I'd like to know the influence that these researchers have on the policymakers that really decide which direction their country is going.
Okay. Lots. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
I was struck in listening to you by a few references to the EU as a
Yes.
model, one reference to India as
Yes.
a model. And in my view, it's important to go back a bit further back in history and focus on the process of the United States formation as another instance of a kind of aggregative process. One that, of course, involves a lot of conflict and war over territory, but also involves the building of an institutional apparatus that didn't exist before. My field is colonial or early national United States history and literature, so that's where I'm coming from. But I think by adding that longer historical narrative, it presents the U.S. as an example of that kind of aggregate process, as opposed to positing the U.S. as always an opponent of those aggregate processes, which is the role that the U.S. has mostly played in recent years. So that would be my contribution.
Okay, thank you. George, would it end at 10:30?
You're fine for, go on for another 5 minutes.
I've got a 60-second answer. The use of force is necessary question. Yes. First of all, I mean, there's a historical transition that is in my mind in which, we take the world as it is today and we see what's happening today, but we move toward a world in which the main enforcement is what I would call police enforcement. Police enforcement is quite different from traditional military combat in the sense that the use of force is very limited. The users of force, that is the police, generally have a monopoly of violence, monopoly on the use of violence within the society. If they have misconduct, there should be means in which to call them to accountability. So, and there's an effort to try to make arrests without killing the people even who are accused of wrongdoing. So there's not a lot of deception involved, which is used in war and so on. So there are big differences, and I want to aim toward police enforcement on the global level. Now, I won't take time to deal with the transitions between now and then. That's the direction to head. And even today's peacekeeping operations should be, insofar as they can be, police enforcement. Same thing should be true in Libya, for example, which would raise some questions. We could have a long discussion about that. But that's the direction. And who should decide? It should be the community-wide authorities. That is, enforcement should occur by a political system that includes all the people on which the enforcement will occur. You don't have one group of people here enforcing the law and another group of people here. You must have all people within the system that does the enforcement represented. Yes, you're absolutely right. The world is complicated partly by the different stages of development at which different societies are. I think that makes coming together very hard, and yet it also presents some very good opportunities. That is, some countries are very capable of helping other countries at almost no harmful cost to themselves they can produce great good in other societies, and it can go both ways. So I don't want to think that there's only difficulty by different stages of development. What influence should peace researchers have on political decision-making? Is that your question?
How do they really influence and what kind of influence?
Yeah. Well, of course, peace researchers should have as much influence as possible, is my view. But I'm an educator, and I think it's primarily through research to point out the realities, and it's through education to get more people to subscribe to our understanding. That is what we do. Now, it's true that a lot of peace research is policy relevant, and those scholars are invited to offer comment on policy making in many countries, in national governments, or in intergovernmental organizations like the UN. George Lopez is a good example of this. You're going to hear David Courtwright next. He's another example. These are people who are very active in the communication between the peace research community and political decision makers. So that should be encouraged, and even more should happen. And I think, for example, the U.S. Institute of Peace is a good institution. We've got to expand it, help it to do more work. It also feeds back into congressional committees or into Department of State, Department of Defense proceedings. The U.S. is a good example, and yet, as U.S. citizens, we need to be very careful about how we use it, because in a global context, using the U.S. example very much gives people the feeling that we think the rest of the world is going to be just like the U.S., or that it ought to be just like the U.S. That's very unlikely. It's also true that the U.S. example is associated a lot with some discredited forms of world government advocacy or world federalism, in which there's a feeling that the whole world can create a world federation that looks a little like the U.S. did after the Articles of Confederation. I don't want to rule that out, but I think we have to be cautious we don't overuse that example. But certainly with U.S.